Part 1. The Pettiest Feuds and Royal Rivalries. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Bedside Chronicles. Tonight, we're drifting back to a world where the people with absolute power used it for the most incredibly small reasons imaginable. So go ahead, settle in, dim the lights, maybe wrap yourself in a blanket like a mildly disappointed medieval monk, and just let your thoughts soften. Because this evening, we're wandering through the strange, sleepy corridors of royal feuds, not the grand, kingdom-shattering ones, but the smaller, pettier, wonderfully unimportant rivalries that somehow shape entire nations. And of course, these feuds usually started because someone sat in the wrong chair, wore the wrong shade of velvet, or breathed in a way another monarch found suspiciously confident. You know, the usual. So let's drift into the first of tonight's quiet disasters. It's hard to overstate just how deeply committed European monarchs were to taking everything personally. We start with Richard the Lionheart and his favorite lifelong hobby, hating his father. Richard was born with the emotional range of a slightly offended swan. He sulked professionally, he rebelled recreationally, and he had a special talent for turning every conversation into a full political meltdown. Richard's father, Henry II, was a hard-working king who wanted his sons to stop breaking Europe for 5 consecutive minutes. Naturally, they refused, especially Richard, who managed to rebel against his father 3 times before turning 25. Which is impressive in a sort of disappointing way. Henry, exhausted and spiritually wilted, once tried making peace with his sons, and Richard responded by invading his territory. Again, because nothing says, "I love you, Dad," quite like burning your father's countryside because you felt underappreciated at dinner. Eventually, Henry died heartbroken, muttering Richard's name. And Richard, upon hearing this, felt absolutely nothing. He reportedly said, "Well, we must all die." A hallmark moment, truly. And so, with that warm familial glow, Richard moved on to his next favorite rivalry, this time with Philip II of France, his frenemy during the Crusades. They traveled together, fought together, argued constantly, and made the entire Holy Land feel like a very tense group project. Philip complained that Richard was too bossy. Richard complained that Philip was too dramatic. Both were correct, and when Richard was captured returning from the Crusades and held for ransom, Philip wrote a letter to Richard's brother John that simply said, "Look, the devil is loose," which was medieval French for "please, I cannot deal with him again." But let's drift further, because the royal world is filled with little storms like this, tiny tempests of ego that left surprisingly long shadows. One of my favorite petty feuds involves Queen Elizabeth I and Mary, Queen of Scots, 2 women who never met, rarely agreed, and insisted on making each other's lives gently miserable. Elizabeth, famously clever and famously suspicious, saw Mary as a walking threat. Mary, famously charming and famously unlucky, saw Elizabeth as an obstacle standing between her and, well, everything she ever wanted. Mary had a habit of marrying the exact wrong men at exactly the wrong time. Elizabeth had a habit of observing all this and sighing theatrically from across the channel. Mary's second husband, Lord Darnley, was handsome, foolish, and once tried to murder Mary's private secretary because he felt left out of a dinner conversation. Elizabeth read the reports and sent Mary sympathetic letters like, "I do hope things improve," which was Tudor code for "you poor disaster." Mary would respond with, "If only I had friends I could trust," which was Queen code for "please send me an army." Elizabeth did not. And of course, it all spiraled downward. Mary fled to England, hoping for support. Elizabeth responded by putting her in very comfortable house arrest for 19 years, long enough for Mary to develop several new hobbies, none of which included escaping successfully. Their feud was built less on hatred and more on mutual exasperation. The slow, simmering kind. The kind that feels like sitting in a room with someone who refuses to leave but also refuses to talk. And when Mary was finally executed, Elizabeth reportedly cried, insisting she hadn't really meant for it to happen. A very Elizabethan conclusion. Emotionally distressed, politically convenient, and delivered far too late. But let's drift to France now, a place where royal rivalries flourished like overwatered houseplants, especially among the Bourbons. Consider Louis XIV, the Sun King, who was deeply committed to shining brighter than everyone else, literally everyone. Servants, generals, members of the clergy, small children. If they looked too confident, Louis felt personally attacked. Louis hated being upstaged, even by accident. One noble wore a particularly nice coat to court. Louis banned the entire color the next day. Another noble built a house slightly more luxurious than the king's hunting lodge. Louis ordered Versailles expanded out of spite, turning it into the world's largest and most exhausting example of one-upmanship. He even feuded with his own heir, the Grand Dauphin, because the Dauphin had the audacity to exist. Louis disliked being reminded of mortality, so he kept his son politically sidelined for decades. By the time the Dauphin was old enough to rule, he was still sidelined, and when he finally died before Louis, the king was reportedly relieved, not sad, relieved. This was a man who saw the entire royal line as a long-running competition, and he fully intended to win by outliving them, which, unfortunately for everyone, he nearly did. Now, drifting softly into the Renaissance, we arrive at the Medici family, Italy's answer to the question, what if a family ran Europe like a mildly chaotic neighborhood bakery? One of the pettiest rivalries of all occurred between Pope Julius II and Pope Leo X, two men who took turns ruling the Catholic Church like rival managers of competing coffee shops. Julius II loved war, armor, and shouting. Leo X loved art, parties, and spending money he absolutely did not have. Julius commissioned the Sistine Chapel, then died before seeing it finished. Leo inherited the project and immediately took credit for everything, even the ceiling. Michelangelo was, as always, suffering through the job and probably wished both popes would find new hobbies. Leo once said, God has given us the papacy. Let us enjoy it, which Julius would have absolutely hated. Their feud outlived Julius, echoing through letters, decisions, and whispered commentary from cardinals who were far too tired for all of this. Moving north again, gently, like a historical cloud, we reached the Scandinavian courts. Surprisingly chilly, surprisingly petty. Meet Queen Christina of Sweden. Brilliant, unpredictable, deeply dramatic. She once abdicated the throne because she didn't feel like ruling anymore, and because Swedish nobles annoyed her by breathing too loudly. Her main rival, her cousin, Charles X. Christina insisted on controlling politics even after stepping down. Charles insisted that abdication meant she should, stop doing that. Christina refused. Charles sulked. Christina plotted a comeback. Charles banned her from Sweden. Christina returned anyway, pretending to be surprised she wasn't welcome. At one point, she even had a former advisor quietly assassinated for disagreeing with her in a cafe. Charles was not thrilled, and shockingly, asked her to leave again. Their feud was fueled entirely by stubbornness, bored royalty, and Christina's lifelong belief that rules were suggestions. And finally, drifting softly through Eastern Europe, wrapped in the velvet gloom of the Habsburgs, we meet Maria Theresa, the formidable Austrian empress, and her rival, Frederick the Great of Prussia. Their feud began when Frederick stole Silesia from her. Maria Theresa responded by declaring she would never forgive him, and she didn't, ever. Frederick admired her intelligence, but found her emotional style too intense. Maria Theresa admired nothing about Frederick and called him a wicked manual. Whenever Frederick achieved a victory, Maria Theresa sighed dramatically. Whenever Maria Theresa reformed her empire, Frederick grumbled. They fought 3 wars, all of which ended more or less how they began, neither willing to concede that the other existed. Yet, interestingly, when Maria Theresa died, Frederick expressed genuine sadness. And when Frederick died, Maria Theresa reportedly said, "May God forgive him," which, for her, was a warm embrace. Their rivalry was the long, slow-burning kind, the quiet storm at the edge of Europe that lingered for decades, shaping countries almost unintentionally. End of Part 1. Part 2. The Secret Lives of Medieval Castle Servants. Hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting deeper into the quieter corners of the past, the parts no one really wrote down because, well, medieval nobles weren't exactly in the habit of documenting the daily struggles of the people who made their lives possible. So settle in again. Get comfortable. Maybe loosen your shoulders a little, because this evening, we're going behind the heavy doors of medieval castles, not to admire tapestries or crown jewels, but to wander through the shadowy halls where the real work happened. This is the secret, exhausting, quietly miserable world of castle servants, and naturally, it was held together by people who were either criminally underpaid, hopelessly overworked, or simply too tired to argue about any of it. So let's sink into it. Slowly, most people imagine medieval castles as glamorous places, glittering halls, velvet robes, noble feasts. But the truth is that for every noble lounging luxuriously, there were dozens of servants scurrying around like stressed medieval ants, trying to keep the entire crumbling system from collapsing. And collapse it would, because medieval castles were not built with convenience in mind. They were built for defense, which is a nice architectural purpose, unless you happen to be the one climbing 6 floors with boiling water at sunrise, because the lady of the house wanted a warm wash basin. Take, for example, the scullery maid, the lowest rung of the entire system. She woke up around 3 a.m., which is technically night, but medieval people loved to pretend it was morning just to feel productive. And she started her day with tasks such as hauling water, scrubbing pots the size of livestock, and scraping hardened food off trenchers that appeared to have been aggressively mistreated at the previous night's feast. Scullery maids lived in a permanent state of dampness, damp clothes, damp hands, damp hair, damp everything. The combination of boiling wash water, stone floors, and the enthusiastic splashing of medieval dishwashing meant they rarely dried out completely. Their diet consisted mostly of scraps, and their sleep consisted mostly of short bursts of despair. From this lowest tier, we gently drift upward, though not by much, to the kitchen boys, a group of adolescent humans whose personalities were carefully shaped by 3 things: fear, smoke inhalation, and whatever the head cook had thrown at them that day. Kitchen boys ran messages, chopped vegetables, and lived in a sort of permanent confusion because everything in a medieval kitchen was hot, sharp, loud, or on fire. These were the same kitchens where nobles demanded feasts involving animals sculpted into other animals, food dyed extravagant colors, and pies that exploded theatrically as birds escaped. All of this required work. And guess who did that work? Not the nobles. Sometimes a noble would wander through the kitchen asking, "How long until supper?" And 20 exhausted kitchen staff members would consider a group rebellion, but they wouldn't do it, because rebellions required sleep, and none of them had experienced that in years. Now let's drift up into the Great Hall, the dramatic center of castle life. The Great Hall was massive, echoing ceilings, banners, torches, and a smell that can only be described as warm bodies mixed with old stew. Keeping that place presentable required an entire fleet of servants. Enter the hall boys, who swept floors that never stayed clean, polished tables that nobles used as cutting boards, and managed the dogs that wandered freely, optimistically waiting for gravy. Occasionally a minstrel would knock something over, or a drunk knight would drop his cup, or someone would spill half a hog roast onto the floor. Hall boys were there for all of it, quietly praying that someday, somehow, they might get promoted to a job that didn't involve stepping in goose fat. But promotions were rare. Medieval social mobility was about as common as well-adjusted royals, a rare, shimmering myth. One rung higher were the ladies' maids and valets, the personal attendants who spent their lives inside the orbit of nobility. This meant they were constantly nearby, watching nobles argue about the exact shade of embroidery they wanted on their sleeves. A valet's job included dressing his lord, brushing his hair, sharpening his weapons, and pretending not to notice when the noble spent 27 minutes complaining about how his boots felt slightly judgmental. Ladies' maids dealt with gowns that weighed more than toddlers, elaborate hairstyles involving pins sharp enough to start duels, and the emotional roller coaster of court gossip. Both roles required an advanced skill set, quiet footsteps, polite nodding, and the ability to stand silently in a room while nobles made decisions that defied all logic. These servant roles were close to power, but still firmly outside it. They were respected enough to be blamed when things went wrong, but not enough to actually change anything. Moving deeper into the castle, we find a far more interesting figure, the laundress. The laundress was responsible for washing clothing, linens, tablecloths, towels, undergarments, and anything else nobles dirtied, which was everything. Nobles loved white fabric, long sleeves, and clothing with complicated folds, but they also loved leaning on greasy tables and eating with their hands. Laundresses spent their lives boiling water, scrubbing cloth, and hoping no one brought in something stained with wine, ink, or blood, all of which were extremely common because medieval nobles lived dramatic lives. Laundry was done outdoors, even in winter, because castles were never designed with practical tasks in mind. So the laundress worked in all weather, rain, sleet, sudden windstorms, rogue castle geese. It was unglamorous, it was endless, and everything was heavy. One load of linens could weigh 60 pounds. 60 pounds. While nobles strutted around in pristine clothing, someone else was hunched over a wooden tub, quietly wishing for reincarnation. And then we drift into the most underappreciated job of all, the gong farmer, the hero no one wanted to acknowledge, the night shift champion of medieval sanitation. Castles produced waste, a lot of it. Gong farmers were the ones who climbed into cesspits, armed with nothing but a bucket, a rope, and existential dread. They worked at night so no one had to witness the process, which is medieval for We don't want to see you or acknowledge that this is happening. The smell never left them. Their clothes soaked it up. Their hair soaked it up. Their souls soaked it up. People knew who they were from a distance. Birds changed direction. Children ran. Dogs barked. And yet, this deeply unglamorous job was essential to keeping castles livable. Without gong farmers, medieval castles would have become uninhabitable swamps of aristocratic decay. Nobles never thanked them. Of course they didn't. But the rest of us can quietly appreciate their sacrifice in the calm comfort of the present. Now, there was also the steward, one of the highest ranking servants. He managed accounts, oversaw staff, handled disputes, and made sure everything in the castle ran smoothly, despite the nobles doing their absolute best to make that impossible. If a noble decided that dinner should begin 3 hours early because he felt spiritually peckish, the steward made it happen. If guests arrived unexpectedly with a demand for entertainment, the steward organized it. If two nobles argued over who sat closer to the fire, the steward strategically managed them into separate chairs. He was the quiet power behind the scenes. Hard accountant, hard diplomat, hard crisis manager. Stewards often knew more secrets than anyone else. They saw everything, every affair, every bribe, every outburst, every midnight kitchen raid by nobles who insisted they never ate after sunset. And because of this sensitive knowledge, they were treated with a strange mix of respect and fear. But perhaps the most invisible servant of all was the night watchman. While everyone else slept, the watchman wandered the silent halls with a lantern, checking for intruders, loose stones, open doors, sick animals, dripping candles, and suspicious noises, which, in a castle, was everything. Medieval castles made plenty of sounds: wind, rats, owls, timbers settling, people snoring, ghosts that were probably just overworked servants walking in their sleep. Night watchmen lived in a state of constant tension, torn between the fear of missing something important and the fear of waking the entire castle for absolutely no reason. Their reward for this vigilance? The privilege of working again the next night. But beneath all these official roles, there was an entire hidden layer of castle life. The informal systems created by servants themselves. Servants formed alliances. They shared food. They shared gossip. They warned each other when nobles were in bad moods. They covered for each other when someone overslept after a 14-hour shift. They had jokes nobles would never understand. They had eye signals for different types of trouble. They developed the ancient art of doing nothing while looking very busy, a skill still practiced worldwide. Their world was its own kingdom, one built on cooperation, whispered warnings, stolen moments of rest, and the common understanding that nobles would not survive 3 days without them. One thing often forgotten about servants is how young many of them were. Kitchen boys started around 7 or 8. Scullery maids could be as young as 10. Apprenticeships began in childhood. Servants rarely had long childhoods. Life was work. Play was brief. Education, if it happened at all, was accidental. Learning by observation, memorization, and occasional panic. Yet despite this, servants became incredibly skilled. A valet could fold clothing with military precision. A cook could feed 100 people with whatever the Lord had accidentally hunted that day. A laundress knew stains like some people know constellations. Their knowledge was practical, hard-earned, uncelebrated, but without it, medieval society wouldn't have functioned. And then, there were the relationships between servants and nobles. Some were kind, some were distant, some were tense in the way only a relationship built on power imbalance can be. Nobles depended on their servants far more than they liked to admit. Servants saw nobles at their worst: ill, angry, frightened, unwashed. They dressed them, fed them, cleaned after them, tended their children, and sometimes saved their lives. But they were always one mistake away from punishment: a spilled wine cup, a misplaced garment, a misunderstood command. Medieval humility was rarely practiced by those who needed it most. Now, one of the more delicate aspects of castle life was the servant economy, an underground system of favors, trades, and quiet exchanges. A stable boy might sneak a bit of hay to the kitchen for extra bread. A maid might pass along gossip in return for a better chore assignment. A guard might not notice a servant napping in an alcove. These exchanges stitched castle life together because official systems were rigid, hierarchical, and unforgiving. But the unofficial systems, those were human, flexible, secret, and often far more efficient. Servants also witnessed the full spectrum of noble absurdity. They saw tantrums over lukewarm soup. They saw attempts at poetry that should have been legally prohibited. They saw marital disputes conducted entirely through dramatic sighing. And sometimes they saw greatness, quiet moments of kindness, generosity, or genuine vulnerability. They saw nobles overwhelmed by responsibility. They saw young lords terrified on the eve of battle. They saw queens pacing during childbirth, praying for safety. Servants held the world together quietly, invisibly, watching, understanding, enduring. So as you settle deeper into the quiet of the night, just imagine the real heartbeat of a medieval castle. Not the nobles in silk, but the servants who moved through stone corridors before sunrise, who cleaned, cooked, hauled, stitched, soothed, and held everything in place. Their lives were hard, their sleep was brief, and their names were rarely recorded. But without them, every castle would have been nothing more than a cold, echoing pile of stone. Drift there for a moment, in that quiet, forgotten world, where the torches burn low, where footsteps echo softly, and where history was carried not by kings, but by the people who worked behind them. End of Part 2. Part 3. The children who saved their villages in the Viking Age. Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting northward, into the cool mist and quiet fir forests of the Viking Age. Not the dramatic version you get in movies with flaming longships and thunder gods stomping across the sky, but the softer, quieter, strangely tender side of the age. The small villages where children, of all people, occasionally saved the day simply because no one else was paying attention. So go ahead and get comfortable. Slow your breathing a little, and let's wander into a world where everyday life was tough, cold, muddy, and occasionally held together by 12-year-olds who were far more responsible than most adults. When we picture Viking Age life, we usually imagine large men with axes, because that's the part that gets illustrated on t-shirts. But the truth is that most Viking settlements were made up of farmers, quiet craftspeople, and a surprising number of sleepy children who were tasked with jobs that would probably violate several modern safety regulations. These children herded sheep. They kept watch over fishing nets. They tended fires, fetched water, and occasionally shooed away the kinds of wildlife that were, by all accounts, deeply unimpressed by humans. And now and then, something happened. Something the adults were too busy, too tired, or too distracted to handle. And so history gives us these faint little stories, half remembered, half legendary, of children who noticed things, acted quickly, and quietly prevented disasters that would have otherwise ruined an entire village. Let's drift through a few of those stories. Gently, one such tale comes from a small coastal settlement in what is now Norway, a place where wooden huts huddled together against the wind, and where people lived off fish, hardy grains, and the faint hope that winter wouldn't last quite as long this year. In this village lived a girl named Asa, around 11 or so. She wasn't a warrior. She wasn't even particularly adventurous. She just had excellent peripheral vision, which, as it turns out, was extremely valuable. One misty morning, while the adults were busy repairing fishing gear and complaining about the weather, Asa noticed something unusual. The shoreline was wrong. It was pulling back, exposing seaweed and rocks that no one had seen above water before. The adults shrugged. The sea did strange things all the time. This was Scandinavia, after all, home of unpredictable weather, unpredictable currents, and unpredictable uncles. But Asa had watched the sea her entire life. She knew how it breathed, and this was not normal. She remembered a story her grandmother had told her about a sudden retreating tide that came before a massive wave, the kind that didn't politely stop at the shoreline. So she ran through the village, shouting the Viking age equivalent of, "Hey, everyone, maybe let's not stand on the beach right now." The adults, being adults, did not immediately listen until one of them looked up and saw the wave, a slow, rising wall of gray water moving with a determination that could only be described as deeply unfriendly. They scrambled inland. They dragged children and tools and food with them. They climbed up the rocky slope behind the village just in time. The water surged through the settlement, knocking over huts, flooding fires, washing away anything not tied down. But no one died, not a single villager. And afterward, when they rebuilt, and they always rebuilt, they quietly thanked Asa for noticing the thing everyone else had ignored. They didn't carve her name into stone. They didn't compose poems about her, but they remembered, and that was enough. Now let's drift a little farther east, toward Denmark, where another story, half legend, half memory, survived the centuries. This one involves a boy named Sven, who was famous for two things: a terrible haircut and an exceptional sense of hearing. His haircut was the result of his older brother attempting to trim it evenly with a hunting knife. His hearing, however, was entirely natural. Sven's job was simple: watch the sheep. Sheep watching was generally considered the perfect task for someone who wasn't particularly bright or particularly ambitious. But Sven was neither of those things. He was simply quiet, quiet enough that he noticed sounds others brushed off as wind or distant birdsong. One evening, while sitting on a grassy hill and wondering if sheep had any thoughts at all, which, based on their behavior, felt doubtful, Sven heard something strange coming through the trees, a rhythmic thudding, slow, heavy, not quite human. It was the sound of raiders, not Vikings this time, but a rival clan from several villages over, who had the charming hobby of stealing livestock and occasionally setting things on fire just to see what would happen. Sven ran, and for someone who looked like he could be knocked over by a determined goose, he ran remarkably fast. He reached the village, breathless, trying to shout a warning, though what actually came out sounded more like a series of wheezes. Fortunately, the adults pieced together the message: "Raiders coming, please panic responsibly." The villagers rallied. They extinguished lights. They hid valuables. They gathered anything remotely weapon-shaped. When the raiders arrived, expecting an easy target, they found a fully awake and extremely irritated settlement. They quickly decided they had somewhere else to be. Anywhere else, in fact, and retreated into the forest with as much dignity as people running away in the dark could muster. Sven returned to his sheep the next morning. One of them, having wandered off, had lodged itself sideways between two trees. Sven sighed and pulled it free because some problems, apparently, were eternal. But again, he was remembered, quietly, without ceremony, as someone who saved his village simply by listening. Next, let's drift into Iceland, where stories were often told around the hearth, especially during the long winter nights when everyone was stuck indoors trying very hard not to annoy each other. One of these old sagas, minor, rarely shared, but persistent, told of a girl named Runa who lived at a small farmstead on the edge of a volcanic plain. Icelandic children, unlike their mainland counterparts, grew up with a very specific kind of danger. The ground itself occasionally tried to kill you. Runa was tending goats, a common task for children, though goats were famously uncooperative and prone to chewing things that were not, strictly speaking, food. While watching them, she noticed that the ground felt warm beneath her feet, warmer than usual. She also noticed the goats behaving strangely. Goats are generally chaotic, but this was a different kind of chaos. Restless, uneasy, they kept turning their heads toward the mountain in the distance, stomping their hooves, flicking their ears. Runa knelt and pressed her hand against the soil. There was a soft vibration, a hum, a warning. She ran home and told the adults something was wrong. They dismissed her. Children, after all, were known for making things up, especially when goats were involved. But then the mountain rumbled, a deep, echoing sound that turned every adult's face the same color as cold porridge. They moved quickly, gathering animals, children, and essentials, and headed towards safer ground before the lava breakout reached the lower slopes. By the end of the night, the farmstead was gone, but the family lived, and so did the goats, who spent the evacuation loudly expressing their displeasure at being inconvenienced. Runa grew up hearing the story retold each winter, how she felt the earth change, how she listened, how she acted before the adults did. A child, saving lives simply because she paid attention. Let's drift a bit southward now, into the woods of Sweden, where the forests were dense, the wolves were common, and the daylight hours were often unreasonably short. This story involves two brothers, both under 10, who were tasked with guarding the grain store, because in Viking villages, the logic often seemed to be, let's give the important job to the children. What could possibly go wrong? The brothers noticed something strange early in the winter. The grain was disappearing, not dramatically, but enough for a child to notice. The adults blamed mice. They blamed moisture. They blamed the general unfairness of life. But the boys insisted something larger was taking it. Something with heavy footsteps. Something that breathed loudly at night. No one listened. Not until the boys set a trap. Not a dangerous one. Just a string with bells and a bit of clever placement, and caught the culprit. It was a starving man from another settlement, sneaking in during the night. Not violent, not hostile, just desperate. The boys didn't shout. They didn't panic. They simply spoke to him and then fetched their father. What could have turned violent? Didn't. What could have escalated into retaliation? Softened instead. The village ended up helping the man's family, who were struggling through a brutal winter. Later, the two settlements formed an alliance that lasted for generations, all because two children were paying attention and chose kindness over fear. And now, let's gently wander to Greenland, to one of the Viking colonies that lived in a world so cold that even the sunlight felt like it needed a blanket. This story is more legend than history, stitched together from fragments of oral tradition. It tells of a boy named Eric, who was responsible for one of the simplest, yet most important tasks in village life, checking the ice. Every winter, the villagers crossed frozen lakes to fish or gather supplies. And every winter, someone had to test the thickness. Usually an adult did it. But this year, the adults were busy preparing for a journey, repairing boats, arguing about tools, and generally being overwhelmed. So Eric went. Quietly, he walked to the edge of the ice with a long stick, tapping it the way he'd seen older men do. The ice looked fine, but the sound was wrong. A hollow echo, faint but present. He backed up, marked the dangerous patch with branches, then returned home and reported what he'd found. The next day, the adults inspected it, and sure enough, the ice collapsed under the weight of just one man's steps. If Eric hadn't checked, if he hadn't listened, if he hadn't bothered, several villagers would have drowned in the freezing water. Instead, the village changed the fishing route. Eric said nothing. He didn't need to. Everyone knew. What's striking in all these stories? Real, half real, somewhat mythical, is not the drama, but the simplicity. Viking age children saved their villages not because they were heroes in a storybook sense, but because they noticed small changes, trusted their instincts, and acted before adults thought to. They didn't swing swords. They didn't deliver speeches. They didn't perform miracles. They simply paid attention to the world around them, a world that was often harsh, unstable, and constantly shifting. The adults were busy. The adults were tired. The adults were preoccupied with the endless work of staying alive. And so these quiet, observant children became the early warning systems of their communities. One noticed tides. One listened to the forest. One felt the trembling earth. One protected food. One tested the ice. And through these small, instinctive acts, they preserved their villages for another year, another season, another winter. End of part 3. Part 4. What travelers on the Silk Road saw at night. Hey friends, welcome back. Tonight we are setting out on perhaps the most remarkable road in human history, the Silk Road. Not the daytime version, bustling with caravans, merchants, and the general chaos of people bargaining over fabric. No, tonight we're traveling the Silk Road after dark, when everything changed. Daylight was for business, dust, noise, and haggling. Night was for stories, shadows, and quiet wonders that only travelers saw. So settle in, slow your breathing, let the world soften a little, and let's wander into the night along the Silk Road. You might imagine the Silk Road as a single long road stretching from China to the Mediterranean, but in reality it was more like a massive web, threads twisting through deserts, plains, mountains, and cities. During the day, it was noisy and exhausting. The sun burned the desert white, the caravans kicked up storms of dust, and merchants argued passionately over things like the price of pepper. But at night, the world exhaled, the wind cooled, and the most unexpected experiences unfolded. Travelers often describe the night as a kind of performance, an ever-changing show put on by nature, spirits, strangers, and the road itself. Maybe that's why so many journals from the era spend more time describing the night than the day. Let's begin in the Taklamakan Desert, sometimes called the desert you go in but don't come out of. A cheerful name, comforting, the kind of place where even the camels sighed dramatically. At night, though, The Taklamakan transformed. The heat slipped away, replaced by an icy stillness. The sand, which glared like a furnace at noon, now glimmered faintly under the moonlight. Every footstep you took sounded too loud. Travelers reported an eerie quiet, not the peaceful kind, but the kind that made you aware, suddenly, of how small you were. Some said you could hear grains of sand moving across the dunes like tiny whispers. The stars above were so bright that even weary merchants, men who spent their days complaining about camel behavior, would stop and stare. They saw constellations from Persia, India, and China overlapping in ways no single sky map could explain. And sometimes, just sometimes, the dunes themselves glowed faintly, not magic, just tiny bioluminescent beetles disturbed by the wind. But to travelers, exhausted and perhaps a little hungry, it felt mystical, and maybe it was. Moving westward, let's wander into the Pamir Mountains, the so-called roof of the world. Here the Silk Road climbed into altitudes where the air turned thin and the nights turned sharp. Travelers lit fires that sputtered in the wind and huddled around them, telling stories in a dozen different languages. Sogdian merchants, Tibetan monks, Turkic caravan guards, Chinese herbalists, Persian musicians passing through. You could learn a whole education in one evening if you listened. At night, snow peaks gleamed like silver teeth. The wind carried strange sounds, stone cracks, ice shifts, distant animal calls bouncing off cliffs. Some travelers swore the mountains spoke, not metaphorically, literally. One Chinese monk noted that he heard a low humming every night, rising and falling like chanting. He insisted it was the mountain spirits. A Persian scholar in the same caravan insisted it was merely wind turbulence caused by elevation. They agreed to disagree. They did that often. Above them, the sky was unbelievably close. So close it felt like you could reach up and brush the Milky Way with your fingertips. The stars reflected off frozen lakes, turning the ground into a second sky. Travelers had to take turns staying awake for the wolves, though. The wolves had their own routines. They did not respect bedtime. Then there were the oases, bright green pockets of life in the dark desert, like lanterns placed at intervals along the road. At night, these oases were often the liveliest places travelers encountered. Imagine a cluster of date palms swaying under moonlight, a spring bubbling quietly, caravans forming rings around tents, the glow of lanterns moving between campfires. Travelers drank tea flavored with spices from one end of the continent and sweetened with sugar from another. Musicians tuned instruments, two-stringed lutes, bamboo flutes, small drums whose rhythm drifted across the water. The air was warm, the laughter soft. Languages mingled as easily as the smoke from the fires. And then came the storytellers. Every culture had them. People who collected tales like merchants collected coins. Some stories were warnings about bandits. Some were jokes about camels. Some were so old no one knew where they began. But all of them were shared under the same night sky, with the same sense of temporary community, because that's what oases offered. A place to belong for a few hours, even among strangers. Of course, not all nights on the Silk Road were peaceful, especially not in the Gobi Desert. The Gobi at night was strange, the kind of strange that made even experienced travelers uncomfortable. For one, the temperature dropped so quickly that water left out in a bowl turned to ice in minutes. For another, the silence wasn't empty. It was full of subtle noises that made no sense. Small clicking sounds, soft thumps, whispers that might have been wind or might have been something else. Many travelers spoke of hearing voices. They sounded far away, like someone calling their name from beneath the sand. Some said they heard bells. Others heard music. Modern scientists now think these were singing sands, dunes that vibrate when wind passes through at certain frequencies. But travelers didn't know that. And when you're tired, cold, and alone in the dark, scientific explanations feel very far away. So they tightened their blankets, stayed close to the fires, and pretended not to hear the desert singing. But the best stories, the ones people still whisper, came from the caravanserai. Caravanserai were ancient inns along the road, built like little fortresses around a central courtyard. At night, they became crossroads of the world. Picture this: merchants from the Middle East tying their horses, Indian traders unloading bundles of cotton, Chinese officials writing notes by lamplight, Sogdian dancers practicing steps behind a curtain, cooks stirring pots enormous enough to feed an army. The courtyard glowed with oil lamps. The walls echoed with footsteps. Spices simmered in the air: cumin, cardamom, cinnamon, garlic. At night, once the gates closed, everyone relaxed. And this was when true Silk Road magic happened. A storyteller from Samarkand would share a tale about a jinn who lived in a teapot. A musician from the Indus Valley would play a flute so sweet it made even camels stop chewing. A doctor from Dunhuang would demonstrate strange herbs that glowed blue in the dark when ground into powder. Travelers exchanged everything: remedies, jokes, rumors, cautionary tales. A caravanserai wasn't just a building, it was a world. Of course, there were also animals. Travelers saw all kinds at night. Camels, for instance, became philosophical after sunset. During the day, they were cranky, loud, and determined to complain about their burdens. But at night, they softened. They folded their legs and stared at the stars with an expression that suggested they were contemplating the meaning of existence. Horses were alert, too alert sometimes. They would suddenly jerk their heads up at the faintest sound, something moving in the dark, something breathing. And sometimes there were actual dangers: bandits, wolves, smugglers, or simply travelers who weren't what they claimed to be. But there were also small, gentle creatures: jerboas hopping around like tiny kangaroos, owls gliding silently over dunes, foxes darting between tents, hoping for dropped scraps. Some travelers left bits of bread out intentionally. They liked the tiny visitors. Then there were the night skies, which changed dramatically depending on where you were. In China, travelers saw constellations arranged like imperial courts and legendary creatures. In Central Asia, they saw the zodiac stretched across the heavens like a great caravan. In Persia, they saw a sky thick with stories, stories written in stars, whispered in poems, taught by astronomers who mapped the world before most people even knew how big it was. On clear nights, you might see shooting stars falling behind dark mountains, or the faint glow of distant cities, or dust in the atmosphere turning moonlight red. And there were rare moments, very rare, when travelers saw something even more magical: the aurora reaching down into the steppes, shimmering faint green. Imagine it: a sky that ripples, a sky that breathes. Travelers would stop walking just to watch, forgetting their exhaustion for a moment. These sights stayed with them for the rest of their lives. Not every traveler slept under the stars. Some chose to camp in rocky outcrops, where the land offered natural shelter. These camps were quiet. Fires crackled softly. People wrapped tightly in blankets turned toward the darkness, listening for anything unusual. And in those moments of quiet, something happened that almost every Silk Road account mentions. People dreamed vividly, not vague, drifting dreams. but intense, colorful visions that felt more real than daytime. Some scholars think it was the altitude, others think it was exhaustion, or simply the mind processing so many different cultures, foods, stories, and landscapes. But travelers swore they saw cities that didn't exist. They met people they'd never met. They watched lands they'd never been to. One Chinese herbalist wrote that he dreamed of a river of gold flowing backward. A Persian trader dreamed of a city where everyone walked upside down. A Buddhist monk dreamed of a giant tree whose roots wrapped around the world. And each morning, they would share these dreams with each other, like a nightly entertainment provided by the universe. But perhaps the most human, most tender part of Silk Road nights was this. People who would never meet again shared moments of deep connection before falling asleep. A guard from Bukhara telling a nervous merchant from China that he would watch over the camp. A mother from Kashmir tucking in her child next to a stranger from Taxila, knowing both families were exhausted but safe. Two travelers trading stories to keep fear away. A musician playing a soft tune as the fire died down. Someone humming quietly. Someone praying softly. All of them remembering that in a world so vast, the night made them small. Small enough that they needed each other. And then morning would come. Abruptly. Harshly. The sun rose fast in Central Asia, almost leaping over the horizon. The cold of night dissolved instantly. The softness vanished. The Silk Road became busy again. Dust, shouts, wheels creaking, merchants arguing. But for one night, travelers had seen things that belonged only to darkness. Things they carried with them long after the journey. Things they would tell their grandchildren someday, long after the road itself changed. Night belonged to stories. Night belonged to mystery. Night belonged to the Silk Road. End of Part 4. Part 5. How medieval mapmakers imagined the edge of the world. Hey friends, tonight we're drifting into one of my favorite corners of medieval imagination. Quite literally, the corners of their world. Because medieval mapmakers didn't just draw geography, they drew dreams, they drew fears, they drew hopes, warnings, and sometimes entire mythological zoos. And when they reached the farthest edges of the parchment, where they no longer knew what existed, they didn't stop, they just got creative. So settle in, let your shoulders drop, let your breathing slow. And let's wander toward the edge of the world as medieval cartographers imagined it, one gentle step at a time. When we talk about medieval maps, it's important to let go of the modern idea of accuracy. Medieval mapmakers weren't trying to be GPS satellites with quills. They weren't too concerned with things like scale or coastal outlines. In fact, many of them had never personally seen a coastline. What they wanted was meaning. Maps were spiritual, symbolic, artistic, and sometimes wildly speculative, but they were never boring, not even for a second. The world they pictured had boundaries, not physical ones, but mental ones, and the edges of their maps acted like mirrors, reflecting everything the medieval mind found fascinating, terrifying, or simply too strange to ignore. Let's begin with the most iconic form of medieval world map, the mappamundi, usually a giant circle representing the earth, with Jerusalem in the center, because of course it was, and everything else arranged around it like a cosmic diagram. Europe sat in one quarter, Africa somewhere below, Asia stretched impossibly wide across the top. And if you looked closely at the edges, that's where the fun started. Monsters, miracles, lost tribes, dragons that looked suspiciously like someone had combined a lizard, a chicken, and a bad mood. Medieval map makers filled blank spaces with possibilities, some charming, some unnerving, Some just confusing. Let's drift toward these strange borders and see what we find. One of the most popular edge of the world features was the Antipodes, the people supposedly living on the underside of the earth. Medieval scholars debated endlessly whether these upside-down humans existed. Some insisted yes, absolutely, and they surely walked upright without falling off. Others argued no, impossible, because no missionary had visited them yet, and therefore they couldn't logically exist. Some medieval maps even drew them, tiny human figures strolling around a circle's bottom edge, quietly defying gravity, doing whatever upside-down people presumably did. But what's beautiful is that despite the uncertainties, medieval mapmakers left space for them. Blank areas weren't emptiness, they were invitations. Then there were the creatures. Medieval maps were basically early fantasy novels. You just happened to unfold them instead of turning pages. At the far borders you'd find blemmies, headless people with faces on their chests, cyopods, one-footed creatures who used their gigantic single leg as a sunshade, cynocephali, dog-headed humans, both feared and admired, panoti, delicate creatures with enormous ears they wrapped around themselves like blankets. These beings weren't drawn as jokes. Medieval thinkers believed the world was vast enough for wonders. To them, it felt arrogant to assume humans were the only shape nature could take. And if a cartographer reached the point where earthly knowledge ended, he simply said, well, something must live there. Then he drew it. Let's wander next toward the ocean sea, the great ring of water they imagined surrounding all land. To medieval Europeans, this wasn't just an ocean, it was an edge, a limit, a mysterious liquid boundary beyond which ships would surely fall into oblivion or drift into eternal mist. Some maps depicted this ocean as calm and soft. Others made it into a swirling, frothing moat populated by enormous fish who looked like they'd eagerly swallow entire ships for breakfast. But the most charming detail, at least to me, is that many medieval maps place paradise somewhere out there, floating at the ocean's rim, the Garden of Eden, drawn as a small circular island with walls of flame and angels guarding the gates. You couldn't sail to paradise. You weren't supposed to, but it comforted people to know it had a place on the map, tucked at the very edge like a reminder that the world was built on stories as much as soil. Now let's drift into the darker corners, the places medieval mapmakers feared. Near the bottom of San Mapamundi is a spot labeled simply Hic sunt Dracones. Here be dragons, not everywhere, just in the areas so unknown they made medieval thinkers uneasy. But interestingly, the dragons were rarely central. Medieval people weren't terrified of the entire world, just the parts that hummed with uncertainty. And instead of ignoring those areas, mapmakers marked them with the symbols of fear. Better to name the darkness than pretend it's not there. One of the most beautifully strange elements of medieval maps was their geography of the imagination. Take the earthly directions on modern maps. North sits at the top. On medieval maps, east, because that's where paradise was, and sunrise, and therefore hope. The world wasn't oriented around magnetic poles. It was oriented around meaning. And if the shape of Africa ended up looking like a melted boot, that wasn't the point. Accuracy was a secondary concern. Symbolism came first. This is why, at the map's edge, you often see not monsters at all, but angels, calm beings blowing wings from the corners of the earth, guiding, watching, breathing life into the very world. To a medieval map maker, the world didn't end at the parchment's edge. It simply passed into the hands of the divine. Now imagine a medieval scribe, seated at a wooden table late at night, His candle flickers. The parchment lies before him. He's copying older maps, adding his own flourishes, adjusting borders based on rumors from travelers. He hears stories from sailors who saw lights hovering over the water. He hears traders speak of deserts so vast they swallow sound. He hears monks describe distant islands where spirits appear in moonlit glows, and he tries to translate these whispers into ink. Does he believe all of it? Not necessarily, but he believes the world is wide enough to hold more than he knows. So he draws it, not because it's certain, but because it might be, and that might is where the medieval imagination lived. Let's float gently toward one of the most fascinating features, the Hereford Mappamundi. It's roughly the size of a dining table and looks a bit like an illuminated manuscript through a party and invited every cultural reference it could find. At its edges, you'll see mountains painted like scalloped shells, rivers curling like ribbons, cities drawn as little castles, sea creatures swimming in circles, politely ignoring the landmass. But there's more, far more. There are illustrations of the man-eaters of India, the desert of Gog and Magog, the phoenix rising from flames, the gates of Alexander the Great, which supposedly kept out the corrupted tribes of the north. It wasn't a map for navigation, it was a map for meditation, a way to understand humanity's place in a world that felt enormous. Let's wander further, to the edges where the known world and the imagined world overlap. Medieval maps often included geographical rumors, passed along trade routes like spices. For example, a kingdom where the rivers were made of honey, a land where people lived without heads, a mountain that touched heaven, an island inhabited entirely by women, a river guarded by serpents big enough to swallow cattle. No one had verified any of this, but no one ruled it out either. Medieval maps weren't scientific instruments. They were cultural memory. Every rumor was a possibility, every blank area a doorway. And if a sailor returned with a dramatic story, well, that was inspiration for the next map. But what fascinates me most isn't the monsters or the mysteries. It's the confidence. Medieval mapmakers never seemed worried about being wrong. If anything, they seemed delighted to draw the unknown. It made the world richer, stranger, more enchanting. There was a profound humility in it, a willingness to admit we don't know everything, but we're curious. And at night, when candlelight flickered across the parchment and the scribe dipped his quill into ink, he wasn't just drawing coastlines, he was drawing wonder. Slowly now, let's turn toward the end of our journey, toward the very edge, the literal edge, a thin line of ink, the border between the world and the blankness beyond. Most medieval maps didn't try to explain what lay outside the circle. They simply let the parchment fade into emptiness. No monsters, no angels, no islands, no paradise, just the quiet honesty of not knowing. It's strangely comforting, because the edge of the world wasn't a cliff or a void. It was simply the boundary of human understanding at that moment in time. And medieval people accepted that boundary with a kind of peaceful awe. They lived in a world where mystery wasn't a problem. It was a feature, something to live alongside, something to imagine into being. And maybe that's why their maps feel so soothing. Even now, they remind us that the world is bigger than our certainty, that there are always edges we haven't explored, that curiosity is as old as ink. So when medieval travelers gazed at these maps before setting out, when they rolled them up and tucked them into satchels, they weren't holding directions, they were holding dreams, warnings, possibilities, comforts, fears, hope. Good night.